Title of my talk is Bridging the AI Implementation Gap. And then the subtitle here is Strategies for Data Professionals that Lead to Successful AI Project Delivery. So for a bit on who am I am co-founder and CTO of Hightouch. I'm about to go into what that company does in the next slide. Should come back to this. So a little bit on who are we. We're a company that really started in the data ecosystem in 2019. A couple different things we offer today, but we primarily focus a lot on selling to data teams with things like reverse ETL, which help you sync data from warehouses into different business systems, and also offering a broader suite of CDP offerings, which I'll explain in the next slide. We work with a lot of different companies overall, but right now I'm just going to focus on enterprise consumer companies that we work with and just kind of focus a lot on that one vertical just to give some concrete examples there. But over the last 6 years, we've partnered with a lot of data teams. So every implementation that we do, every time that we're standing up a new use case, we're always partnering with data analytics, marketing analytics, data science. It's different names, different role divides in every company, but we've gotten the chance to partner with hundreds of really great data companies across very traditional companies, tech native companies, B2B companies, the whole spectrum. I think that's given us a pretty unique perspective into what kinds of operating patterns work well for data teams that are trying to deliver on very, very ambitious projects for their organizations. So at the bottom of here, these are some of the logos that we have as companies, and these data teams oftentimes are super sophisticated, a lot of these companies, and it's really been a huge privilege to get to work with a lot of them. So what are some of the things that we do as a company? We kind of put modern data systems at the center of all that we do. So we really brought to market this term called composable, which just means that everything that we do is connecting to internal data systems of companies. So instead of us being a data store where you send all of your data to us and then we host a lot of data, we're actually connecting to systems like Databricks, Snowflake, directly to lakehouses, things like that. And so there's kind of a right to left spectrum here where we can do things like help to track events for your customers and then sync those into data warehouses so you can track nice clean data from different places. We can assist with verticalized data transformations like identity resolution, things like that. Most of our focus as a company has historically been on this right area. So it's really how do you put data to use in an organization? So we usually use the term called data activation for this, which is you have all this data in one place. Now, how do you actually use this to drive business results? And that's been an area of focus for us for a long time. So originally what we did was sync data into different tools. And then we also offer other visual UIs for teams doing marketing experimentation to do a lot of this work in a self-service manner. The focus of this talk is actually going to be in that purple box called AI decisioning, which is an application for reinforcement learning for marketing experimentation use cases. And just talking about some of the stories that we've had with customers where it's a little bit harder of a product to stand up. And I think the goals here are a bit more ambitious where you're using AI to automatically send messages to customers, find insights, and continuously optimize that. So as part of this, we've kind of gone through this journey of partnering with data teams to deliver on these more ambitious AI projects. So I'll talk a bit about those and I'll also talk a bit about some of the just AI projects that we've seen our customers doing that have been successful. So first, I just want to get a little bit of context around how AI decisioning works. So basically, the problem here that we're tackling with most of the companies that we talk to is that marketers and data teams are really having a hard time finding what's the right thing to send to each customer. So there's all these different choices across a bunch of different dimensions, should I send them an email or a text, and what kinds of messages should I send to them? So there's basically unlimited combinations here, and I think this kind of opportunity in general makes for a pretty good AI project, which is where we focus on with AI decisioning. And so what we do is apply reinforcement learning where you define what's the outcome that you're trying to drive in the business. And then we use reinforcement learning to test out different messages and continuously improve our system to figure out on an individual by individual basis what's the best message for them. So very similar to technologies that you'd see in your TikTok newsfeed or ad systems, things like that. We're bringing this to companies, partnering with data teams to deliver on that same technology for their own customer base as opposed to through ad systems. So just a little bit on architecture for how this works and how we're partnering with different data teams. So we're connecting to the centralized data store of the companies that we're working with. We're integrating with data science models, the analytic outputs that are kind of living within these data warehouses. And then we're building models on top of that that are then being delivered through a bunch of different marketing and advertising platforms. And then we measure to see what's the impact each time that we're sending out messages to customers. And then we use that to continuously get better and better. So the topic of this talk and what our overall thesis is that we're seeing that all across our customer base, data teams are starting to tackle more and more ambitious AI projects, which we think is a very good thing. For a lot of companies, data teams are really in a good place to build out more sophisticated AI projects. A lot of times, AI projects have a massive seam with data, and so they're a very natural place for data teams to govern and own these kinds of projects. And there's also data product and analytical foundations behind a lot of these different AI projects. There's a couple theses here that we have around this that we've seen overall, which is that the shape or like categories of different AI problems that people are trying to target, they're pretty broad. And a lot of them actually have different properties, which end up leading to like rabbit holes or different levels of complexity across those different AI problems. And then depending on what type of AI project you're tackling, the way that you manage these projects might be quite different than the way that you would think about typical analytics or data science outputs or like data products. So basically, if AI product was a thing, it would actually be quite different than data products. And like the shape of those two things can be quite different. So there's lots of different AI projects. I think it would probably take an entire talk to just categorize the different kinds. But I just want to give a sample here of the different things that we've seen and like just giving like a glimpse into like the different characteristics of these just to show you how one might be different than the other one in terms of complexity. So one thing that we see most commonly probably is people doing like things like propensity scores or likelihoods to churn, predictive LTV, like those types of projects. So just as a broad category, predictive ML and modeling work. We're starting to see more and more folks doing content generation as well. So applying LLMs to generate new types of content that could be sent to customers. And then there's another category here which kind of gets into more like reinforcement learning, where you're studying the system that will autonomously take an action and then measure success and then do that basically in a loop. And then you also have things that are kind of similar to this, but more based on like LLM-based agentic workflows, where it's more of like a reasoning-based approach where you're putting LLMs at the core of what you're doing. So our core thesis here is basically the closer that you get to true automation and the closer that you get to trying to deliver on an agentic workflow for your business, the harder that project is going to be, and not even necessarily just for tech reasons, but also for a lot of other reasons that we'll cover. So if you're doing like predictive ML work and a lot of modeling work, oftentimes the way that you would deliver that value to stakeholders actually looks a lot like your normal data product. So it's measurable, you're delivering data, at least in some form. Like you might be like exporting a score to another tool, but the handoff point there is really much more like you're exporting data to another stakeholder. Obviously, you still need to know how that data is used, you need to measure it and all those kinds of things, but the workflow of how that data is used is going to look more like a standard data product. The closer that you get to actually taking action and setting up an AI system to connect to other systems and then automate some kind of process, that's going to look a bit different. And so the delivery to stakeholders in these projects is going to be much more complicated because you're actually standing up some kind of autonomous system. And so this will actually require a much deeper awareness of the goals of your stakeholders and what you're trying to accomplish and what their workflows are and what their processes are. So I'll walk through a kind of a handful of case studies here of across all the companies we've seen, just some like examples of successful AI projects and then projects that haven't been like nearly as successful. So starting off, can't give the exact name here of this company, but it's basically a fitness subscription product where their customers are paying them like a monthly fee in order to use this product. Their business model is a subscription, which means that whenever a customer churns from the product, they're losing out on that recurring revenue. And they rely a lot on a user coming back into the application to drive engagements. And they just find that in general, people who use the application more are going to be associated with retention, which makes sense. And so one of their big missions here, and what they were trying to use AI decisioning for, was they wanted to figure out which product features make sense to promote. That's one of their best levers to getting people to engage with the products and continue to be retained. And so they have this catalog set up of various push notifications, all grouped by the different product features that you could have sent out to customers. But there's also really different affinities between each user and like what type of product feature that they might want to adopt. So basically, in summary here, the mission of like what we were trying to accomplish with this company was we want to retain their user base by promoting like the right product features to the right user. And so within this example, there was actually this hidden data project, which is how do we actually know which of those product features drive retention? They're not actually all going to be equally weighted, like 1 to 1 to 1. So there was a question within this, which was how do we figure out how do we weight these different features? And so this is actually something where the data science team helped a lot with this part. And I think the operating model of how data science integrated with the other teams at this company actually really made this project successful. And so what they did in this case was they built out different predictive models to identify basically the correlations between all these different product features and the existing adoption and the churn of different customer segments. This model is actually how we weighted all the outcomes of the AI decisioning. So we found like the top 10 key drivers, and then we like weighted more towards those ones, and that's what we were steering the system towards. So this has been like a really successful project, and I think the key input coming from the data team here was a very big part of that. So like I think what made this specific collaboration like really successful here, I think this company was a really good model for how data science and marketing were working together. So I think the data science team was around 5 or 6 people at the time that we had done this. And the data science team was extremely aligned with growth of this company. We see an opposite pattern in other companies where data science tends to be a bit more segregated, and they don't actually work nearly as closely with other stakeholders within marketing. So data science was certainly not reporting into marketing in this circumstance, but I think the way that they were collaborating with marketing, it really felt like they were all part of the same team, and they were aligned along like missions and pods, and like making sure that they all thought about the same outcomes, even if they were in different organizations. The marketing side, I actually think, was a really big part of this as well. They're very data-driven, and they actually understand that data is really important for how they plan, how they measure, how they analyze things. And they actually looped in the data science team really early in key projects. So even when we first started out looking at this project, from day one, like data science was in the room looking at the feasibility of the project, thinking about what kinds of inputs they would need in order to make this successful. And in general, I think like the marketing team, when they're reflecting on what are the goals as a business, they really seem to consult with data science quite a bit in order to understand like what's feasible and like what's the highest ROI. So I'll go through another case study here, which is like a bit similar. This one we can speak about, but one of our customers in the United States is this company called PetSmart, which many of you may know, but they're a very big retailer, and they have a lot of different retail locations. And like a lot of retailers, like people are buying things all the time. Oftentimes there's like recurring purchases, and so they offer this functionality called AutoShip, which basically sends recurring orders to customers. And they're trying to figure out, like, of all the people who are in their customer base that are buying things pretty often, who are the ones that are most eligible for AutoShip, and then how do we send like the right messages to them in order to get them to enroll in AutoShip. So that's kind of what their mission was here, is like, let's make sure we send like the best personalized offers and discounts based on like what people are buying to get them to enroll in AutoShip. So this was a pretty recent use case for us. We're actually not fully stood up here yet, but I think this is a really good case study in a lot of ways, because the why for like why we're able to get this set up so quickly is actually pretty interesting. So within PetSmart, they have a data science team, they have a marketing analytics team, they have a marketing team. Their marketing analytics team reports to marketing and is really focused on the day-to-day workflows of the marketers. And so they're really analyzing the nitty-gritty of all the campaigns. They have a really strong mental model for what types of campaigns and like what customer affinities are. And I think the data science team is in the background doing like deeper and longer projects. And so when we partner with PetSmart on this, we actually partner more closely with the marketing analytics team as opposed to the data science team. And I think for us, I think that was a really interesting insight, because we found that the marketing analytics team was actually really good at generating user features that fed into our models in order to find like the right correlations in the data. And I think the reason that marketing analytics was so well suited to this was they lived and breathed alongside the marketing team, and they really knew they really had a good sense for the data of what our customer preference is. They had these like good mental models around the personas that were actually in their customer base. And I think as a result of that, they actually had a pretty good intuition for how do I aggregate my past data into user features in a way that really captures like the essence of a customer, which is like what good user feature creation is really about. And so I think our big takeaway here is a lot of times like the people who are technical stakeholders that might be reporting into business functions are actually the people who have like the highest levels of business context. And even if it's like their specialty isn't necessarily data science, they're actually really good collaborators on AI projects. A lot of times AI projects, it's actually more about understanding the business and the customer and like that context in a more technical manner than it is having like formal background in data science. And I think this pattern actually applies across like a lot of examples as well. So last case study here. There's a company that's a meal subscription service. So they're delivering at-home cooked services. And they have a problem where people sign up for the service and then they stay on it for months or years and then they churn. And so they're really trying to focus on winning back churned customers through personalized messaging. So they had a really cool internal project. And so to note too, this actually has nothing to do with us, but this was something that we had just observed by talking to this customer, and they were excited to talk about it. So we got the chance to learn about something really cool that they had done with data, which is basically using predictive modeling and generative AI in order to generate really personalized subject lines, all for these win-back campaigns. I think it was probably the best example that we've seen of an internal successful generative AI project at companies that we worked with. So the project started with these two different teams that were involved. There's different data science teams, but there's one pod that was assigned to this project. And then there was a marketing pod who was focusing on win-backs within the company. So marketing here was responsible for thinking about the campaign ideation and the execution of experiments. Historically, they were also generating all these different subject lines and testing on those as well. And then the data science team, who most of their time they typically focus on running experimentation programs and predictive models, they wanted to experiment to see if generative AI could generate like a pretty high ROI here for the business. And so like two of them had kind of collaborated to suggest that maybe we could auto-generate a lot of these subject lines and test that out and see if that's a good opportunity. So in the early phases of this, they actually saw a lot of success with this project. So they ran like a quarterly experiment where they tested out all these different personalized subject lines. In general, like personalized marketing does tend to drive a lot of ROI, and the quality of things that were generated was actually quite high. So it was really good in the beginning, and then the problem after that was they have a lot of different marketing campaigns and they have a lot of different teams. So they had a good initial success, but despite that, they actually still haven't been able to roll out this project super broadly across different marketing teams. And even within the initial team, even within the initial use case of Winbacks, they're still actually struggling to get that use case to be continuously maintained and like continuously used over time. And so what is that? And so like the root of this was actually that it wasn't really a data problem at all. The workflows around the marketing team were actually quite complex. So they had these really standardized processes that they were really used to operating in, which is that they were planning on a quarterly basis, making a bunch of new campaigns and sending those out and measuring them, and they would continuously do that. So I think what the data team here might have been expecting was that they have these messages that are always being sent out to customers over time, but really they're actually all quite short-lived. And so I think what they didn't realize was even if you could really improve the performance of campaigns in a quarter, it's actually not gonna like last forever because you're gonna have a whole new set of things coming for the next quarter. So it's made this project actually like a lot more difficult. So there was still a lot of manual processes where the data team was actually working and doing like a lot of like one-off stuff to generate these subject lines. And they haven't yet been able to get it to a point where it's more of like a self-service thing used by the marketing team. So in order for this to be like a long-term successful thing, they either need to move the marketers to be making content that kind of lasts forever and is always being improved, or they need to figure out a way to self-service a tool to the marketers so they can generate subject lines in their own way without having to put a Jira ticket in for the data team to create those new subject lines. And so I think in the end, it was really just like the workflow thing here that's like preventing this adoption. I think it actually generates like a lot of high ROI. And it hasn't really gotten to the state where it's default used yet in this business. So lastly, I'll just talk about a couple kind of like general tips that we've seen from like the dozens of these case studies of how to align AI projects for success when you're trying to implement these in your organization. So from what we've seen, these are really like the top 5 different failure modes, and we'll kind of like go through each one of these one by one. So the first one may be pretty obvious, but the biggest thing for a lot of these projects is that they typically involve a bunch of different teams. So stakeholder alignment is a really, really important part of this. And so like for all these AI projects, like the most important questions are, how will this affect other teams? And like what kinds of resources do they have in order to involve in this project? Every project is going to have a different ratio of time that's going to be the data team doing work and also like the stakeholders doing work. Understanding those kinds of ratios and understanding your asks of what the stakeholders are upfront is a really important thing. And so there's a lot of hard questions that people are sometimes afraid to ask different business stakeholders, but asking the questions like, are you willing to automate this thing? If you're going to deploy AI here, how would you build trust in this? How do you measure this? How would you review this? And like, do you need to have a human always in the loop? Do you need it like sometimes in the loop? And then, is everybody going to be able to articulate what the end state of this project is? And then there's kind of a specific example here, and I think it might seem nuanced, but we've seen this commonly enough now that I think it's like a really important thing to call out, that a lot of times like there's stakeholders where you may be collaborating with different individuals across different teams, but whenever you're thinking about taking on a broader, multi-quarter, really complex, and maybe a high-risk project as well, it's actually pretty important to make sure that the leader of the different business units are really bought into this mission. And the sooner that you do that, the better. So where this can go wrong is basically you can ideate a project, and there's people who may help you implement this. They're very excited about it. You may have estimates around how long this project will take. Maybe they're a little bit off. And then at a certain point, the sunk cost thing may make its way up to the executive, and they might say, okay, this is actually pretty high risk. Like, we have a lot of short-term goals that we need to hit, and so we're going to kill this project. And after all the time and effort that goes into that, that's a very devastating thing to morale. So I think even if it's really hard and kind of like awkward to like make sure everybody's like really aligned in this mission, it's important to get the right people in the room to get their blessing to think about the longer term investment that's needed for some of these different kinds of projects. And a lot of times, like, executives have different tolerances to risk and different levels of excitement around AI. So some CMOs very, very excited about it. Some are not excited about it. And the earlier you know that, the better, because like the worst case is that everybody seems excited about a project, but then you find out that the CMO doesn't actually think that AI is like a high priority right now. So have the hard conversations earlier is the main thing here. I think this is something that like people talk about on Twitter and LinkedIn very often. Probably like one of the most obvious things here, but there are actually so many data inputs that go into data projects. Like if you look at past like the case studies we had earlier, if the quality of data wasn't there, people wouldn't have been able to build the predictive models that go into various kinds of reinforcement learning. And so if you can't trust your data, if it's not labeled very well, and you don't feel like it's going to be delivered on, in a timely manner, especially for a lot of agentic processes, if you're not ETLing your data in at least every day, that means you're going to need like retraining things or measuring things on a couple day loop, which may not be fast enough. So a lot on the data infrastructure side, there's a couple of things that most companies need to get right for some of these kinds of projects. So I think that's making sure that you have all the data ETL'd into one place, that you have all that modeled in a way where everybody kind of understands that data, and that there's no data quality gaps within that. On the data quality side, I think one thing that becomes even more important for AI projects is like the semantic labeling of different things within your data warehouses. So for an example, a lot of marketers today run campaigns, and they're planning out the campaigns in their head, and they're plotting out on a calendar. It's like a very manual process. So they don't actually have a need to tag their campaigns and say, this is part of this marketing strategy, or this is the outcome of this campaign. But if you want to start doing things where you're predicting success across campaigns and thinking about automating campaigns, that kind of semantic labeling is going to be really necessary for you to carry over learnings across quarters and across different campaigns. So I think the semantic labeling actually becomes a lot more important as you have AI looking at these various things. And that might seem easy at first, but it actually can take a lot of time to do labeling. So it's actually a very important thing to like start that as early as possible in a lot of these projects. There's a flip side here though too, which is that we see a lot of companies get very hung up on data quality to the point where it ends up being a very big blocker for projects that it's pretty clear that the data quality is probably fine for that project. It might be different, like I think for AI, where sometimes like you really do need to make sure like a lot of your ducks are in order there. But yeah, so basically there's a Goldilocks on this on data quality where it's enough where you can trust it and you feel pretty confident that it's going to work for a given use case. But you also don't want to over-rotate too much here. And we've just seen so many very tangible examples of people chasing like a really, really strong customer 360. And a lot of those aspects of those customer 360, if you were to look at how are these actually going to be used across different use cases, it's more of a theoretical thing that the data should look like this and that it should be nice and unified here. And so really, I think this is easier said than done, for sure. And so I think a lot of this requires an awareness of, on a use case by use case basis, like what are your needs from data quality and customer 360 and any kind of data transformation initiative. So it's actually a hard problem, for sure. But I think there's a tendency to, in some organizations to over-rotate here a little bit and spend too long on data quality initiatives when sometimes like perfect can really be the enemy of good, and these projects will actually be fine with like a simpler level of data quality. Another one, and I think this is very, very prominent with AI in particular, is that it's really easy for scope creep to creep in. So with AI projects, especially ones that are you're thinking about automations, agentic processes, reinforcement learning, the projects can get really complex really fast. And so thinking about this as if you were like delivering a product to the market, adopting like a crawl, walk, run mindset. So like kind of going back to that example of the generated subject lines for the food delivery service. Really, I think that was like the right call in the end to actually try this out manually and like make it so that data science is in the loop and testing out these things on a quarter-by-quarter basis. They at least now know that if they do certain things, they can generate business ROI. And now they're kind of ready for the next step, which if they want to continue to invest in this, so they can prove this out, is develop more internal tools, make it more self-service. That's really what gets them to like that walk and run milestone. But really taking a step back and thinking about what's the smallest MVP that'll prove out what you're trying to do. Oftentimes, like that's really worth defining very clearly up front and making sure that you deliver that and thinking about next, like, okay, how do we scale this? Like don't be too ambitious up front. Another one here too is with a lot of AI projects, once you get into thinking about different business stakeholders, a lot of times it's actually pretty necessary to be aware of what their processes are to a really strong degree. So especially when you're doing things like trying to like automate some portion of a workflow, you really need to understand that workflow very deeply to think about how does this all fit together. You'll probably find that like there's going to be tech challenges, but there's also going to be challenges that just more of like a product management nature of just understanding different business teams and like how their workflows are going to adapt to the introduction of AI or even like predictive modeling and things like that. I think knowing where your project fits in that spectrum of is it going to look more like a deliverable of a data product where people are looking at insights and dashboards and a human can consume insights and then use that in their workflow versus a workflow being automated. Anytime that you have a workflow being automated, you're going to need to understand that workflow a lot more. Because with a typical data product, you can have a business stakeholder actually encode a lot of that thinking about their workflow, and they can just do that on their own. And they just need to get the data inputs in order to accomplish that workflow. So there's a different level of automation here, and I think that means that the level of understanding of workflow goes up pretty dramatically. Last one here too is just given the complexity of some of these projects, I think there's a mindset that you can approach here, which is that these are really something where product management, almost in a more formal sense, is kind of necessary. So talking to internal stakeholders and treating them almost as if they're a customer, that's really the right mindset that you need to deliver on a complex multi-quarter project, especially ones that kind of get into like the more like agentic AI type opportunities. And so with these kinds of projects, basically somebody is going to need to be playing the role of product manager for the success of these projects. It doesn't need to be a product manager. It actually could be somebody on the data team. It could be a stakeholder within the business teams. But if you don't have somebody who's DRI in that and responsible for making sure that the workflows are understood, like everybody's aligned, that there's a plan around the workflows, it's actually really nice to centralize that as opposed to having too many meetings where it's not really clear who's the person driving this project. And so, there's actually a lot of opportunities here in actually hiring people who are product managers to guide these kinds of projects. Could be somebody elected, from data to do these kinds of things. But as long as somebody is playing the role, this is pretty important. Not every project needs like this level of centralization, but I think once you approach a certain level of complexity, you just reduce the risk to your project substantially by having like one DRI who's thinking about the use cases and like talking to people and like thinking about how it's all going to be delivered. This role division here is actually really important. You just don't want to have too many people thinking about the delivery of these projects. Oftentimes people who are the hardest in the tech, they may not be like the best ones to do these kinds of things. There are also going to be very hard tech problems in a lot of this too. So it may not be the person who's strongest in the tech that's best suited to deliver on these kinds of things. All that is to do with more with like project management and collaborating across different business units. And like that oftentimes is a very different skill set than the people who are solving those hard technical problems to deliver on these kinds of things. Cool. That's all I had. So very happy to answer questions here.